Hello, welcome back to my channel, Future X USA for a Generation. Europe believed the nightmare of total war had passed into history. The Berlin Wall had crumbled, the Soviet Empire had collapsed, and for a brief moment, the continent seemed united in prosperity and peace. Borders were opened, economies intertwined, and the idea of a lasting security under NATO's shield became the foundation of Europe's confidence. But history has a way of returning. Beneath the optimism of the 1990s and early 2000s, Russia never forgot its loss nor forgave its humiliation. The Kremlin did not see the collapse of the Soviet Union as liberation but as catastrophe. And as the years passed, Moscow sharpened new weapons less visible than tanks, less obvious than missiles, but no less dangerous. Europe was walking into a storm it did not yet recognize. The first great shock came in 2014. In the dead of winter, strange soldiers appeared in Crimea. They wore no flags, no unit patches, just green uniforms and discipline. Within days, they had seized airports, blocked Ukrainian bases, and surrounded government buildings. The world watched with disbelief as an entire peninsula was swallowed almost without a fight. These little green men were the face of something new, a style of war where deniability, speed, and confusion became as powerful as firepower. Russia called it a return of its strength. Europe called it a violation of international law. But the truth was simpler. It was the rebirth of empire, tested in the shadows. The annexation of Crimea was not the end, it was the beginning. As Europe debated sanctions and diplomacy, Russia unleashed another front of attack, one invisible but far-reaching. News outlets, social media, and entire online ecosystems were flooded with narratives crafted in Moscow. Propaganda told Russian citizens that Crimea had always been theirs. At the same time, Western audiences were targeted with half-truths, doubts, and divisions. Conspiracies spread, trust eroded, and suddenly the information space itself became a battlefield. Ukraine paid the highest price. In Donetsk and Luhansk, armed groups, backed and supplied by Moscow, ignited a war that tore the country's east apart. What looked like a local rebellion was in fact an extension of Russia's strategy. Soldiers blended with civilians, weapons flowed across borders, and cyber attacks crippled Ukraine's networks. Entire cities lived in fear, not knowing whether the next attack would come from the sky, the street, or the screen. But Ukraine was only the front line. The real target was larger, Europe itself. Russia understood that NATO's strength was not just military, it was unity. If that unity could be fractured, if European states could be made to distrust one another, the alliance could be weakened without a single shot fired. And so the Kremlin widened its campaign. It hacked government servers in Germany. It poured money into political movements in France and Italy. It tested cyber weapons on the Baltic states. Even elections were not safe. Whispers of interference reached as far as Washington and Brussels. Every crisis, every protest, every division became fuel for Russia's grand strategy. To keep the West off balance. But Moscow had another weapon, perhaps its most powerful one: energy. For decades, Europe had grown dependent on Russian gas. Pipelines like Nord Stream carried not only fuel but leverage. Every winter, the same threat hung over Europe. What if Moscow turned off the tap? It was not an idle question. On multiple occasions, Russia cut supplies to Ukraine and reduced flows to others, reminding the continent that warmth in the cold months came at the Kremlin's mercy. Tanks could be stopped at borders, but dependence ran silently through the veins of Europe's infrastructure. By the time Russian tanks rolled openly into Ukraine in February 2022, the stage had already been set. This was no longer a conflict in the shadows. It was full-scale war. Yet even here, hybrid tactics were everywhere. Cyber attacks struck Ukraine's banks and ministries in the opening hours of the invasion. Disinformation flooded social media, portraying Kyiv as already fallen. Its leaders fled. At the same time, sabotage teams moved ahead of the front lines to cut power, destroy communication, and spread terror. The hybrid war had become total war. Europe was forced to awaken. For years, some had dismissed Russia as a declining power, its economy small, its military outdated. But in the fire of Ukraine, they saw something else. A state willing to use every tool, legal, military, civilian, overt, covert, to achieve its goals. Hybrid war was no longer theory. It was reality. Yet the story is not one of despair. For if Russia adapted, so too did Europe and Ukraine. The European Union, often divided, moved with surprising speed. Sanctions cut into Russia's economy. Banks were frozen. Oligarchs saw their yachts and fortunes seized. Germany, long hesitant, reversed decades of policy and began to rearm. Finland and Sweden, nations once neutral, chose NATO membership. What Russia had sought to divide, it had instead united, at least for now. On the battlefield, Ukraine harnessed its own form of hybrid resilience. While Russia struck with missiles, Ukraine struck back with intelligence. Networks of civilians reported troop movements with smartphones. Engineers improvised drones from commercial parts. Hackers, some state, some volunteer, launched attacks deep into Russian systems. The war had blurred the line between soldier and civilian, between battlefield and home front. It was the truest face of hybrid war. Every citizen a participant, every tool a weapon. But the conflict is not confined to trenches or missiles. It seeps into economies. As gas flow shrank, Europe scrambled to find alternatives. Prices soared, industry strained, households shivered. Yet in that hardship came transformation. Terminals for liquefied natural gas sprang up in record time. Renewable energy projects accelerated. Step by step, Europe began to cut the chains of dependency that Moscow had wrapped around it for decades. Still, the danger remains. Russia is not finished, and hybrid war does not end with ceasefires. In Africa, Russian mercenaries spread influence, displacing European missions. In the Middle East, Moscow positions itself as a broker of power. Online disinformation continues to erode trust in Western institutions. The battlefields of tomorrow may not be Mariupol or Kharkiv, but the minds of ordinary citizens scrolling their phones late at night, unsure of what is real. And so the question lingers, is Europe ready for the long war? Not just the war of trenches and artillery, but of ideas, of energy, of cyber, of unity. Because hybrid war has no front lines. It is everywhere, all the time, relentless and subtle. It seeks not only to break armies, but to break willpower. History teaches that empires rarely fall quietly. They fight, they claw, they adapt. Russia, in its own eyes, is not merely defending territory, it is reclaiming destiny. Europe, in contrast, is defending an idea that peace can last, that borders matter, that the future belongs not to the strongest fist, but to the strongest union. These two visions are colliding, and the shock waves are being felt around the globe. From Washington to Warsaw, from Berlin to Bucharest, leaders speak of a new era of confrontation. Defense budgets rise. Factories once silent hum again with the production of arms. Generals dust off strategies that have been shelved since the Cold War. And in the background, ordinary citizens wonder, how long will this last? What sacrifices will be required? The truth is stark. The war has already changed Europe. It has changed how it sees itself, how it defines security, how it measures freedom. Even if tomorrow the guns in Ukraine fell silent, the shadow of hybrid conflict would remain. For trust, once broken, is not easily restored. And the Kremlin has shown that in the 21st century, conquest does not always march on tanks. It can arrive disguised as information, as trade, as friendship, until it is too late. So when we speak of Europe today, we must abandon the illusion that peace is permanent. The continent stands in the middle of a new struggle, one that will not be decided quickly. This is a war of patience, of endurance, of constant vigilance, A war where every citizen, every government, every institution plays a part. The story of Europe in this century will not be written only in treaties or speeches. It will be written in resilience, in whether nations can withstand pressure without fracturing, in whether societies can remain open without being exploited, in whether unity can survive the storm. For the storm is here. It has already broken over Crimea, over Donbas, over Kiev. It has rattled the halls of Brussels and the streets of Berlin. It has echoed in the gas prices paid by families, in the fear of cyber blackouts, and the flood of propaganda that fills our screens. A hybrid war is not coming. It is already upon us. And yet, in the midst of this trial, there lies a truth older than war itself, that survival belongs not to the aggressor, but to the steadfast. Europe has been shaken before. It has been divided, invaded, occupied, scarred, but each time it has risen. The coming years will test it again, perhaps as never before. The outcome is uncertain, but the choice is clear, because in this new war, the battlefield is everywhere. The weapon is everything, and the price of defeat is not just land, it is the future itself.